Okay, our next podcast is going to go into the cell and structures inside the cell. So a tour of the cells, what we're going to be looking at, all the internal organelles in the cell and how they're organized and what a little bit about what their functions are. So we can start by looking at some cells. This is a image of a cell that has some bioluminescent techniques that have been added to it to make certain things of the cell stand out. We see the nucleus right here is luminescent with a color, and then we have certain cytoskeletal structures that are in there that you can see. There's all types of techniques that are used to within the field of microscopy to see and understand more about what is inside of the cell. We started in our outline there by mentioning some of the important figures or um, scientists of the past that have helped to uncover certain things. We mentioned Leeuwenhoek. He was one of the first to see single-celled organisms moving under a microscope. Robert Hooke was the first to see cells within tissues, and then Virchow was the first to develop the cell theory that we recognize that all living thing comes from cell and metabolism occurs in cells. So this shows us right here the microscope lets us see inside the cell. It was once thought that the cell was just a blob of protoplasm and not a lot of things were occurring inside, but now we know there is quite a bit of complex machinery inside the cell where a lot of metabolic processes and various genetic functions and all types of things are happening in the cell. We can see some of these with our more advanced microscopes. The light microscope will show us cells, and some of the larger organelles we can make out with a light microscope like what we use in the lab. And then there's another microscope called an electron microscope that rather than light, it emits waves of electrons, and we can see more detail in higher images with those. We can see some of those smaller structures and even molecules we can see with electron microscopes. So what we're going to be looking at are the major organelles within the cells. Now, before we mention the organelles, we can mention there are different types of cells. We've talked about this before. You have your bacterial cells, which are prokaryotic cells, such as these right here. And then we have our eukaryotic cells that are like our cells and more complex cells. There's some things that they have in common and some differences in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So in prokaryotic cells, we have genetic information that is not housed in a membrane bound organelle like in our cells, in eukaryotic cells. So it has genetic information, but it just kind of floats around within the structure itself. Also, bacteria have do not have a lot of the internal organelles, complex organelles that we're going to go into. So they're very simple in their structures. There are some bacteria that have a rigid cell wall that surrounds the cell. They have a membrane like our cells, but they also have a rigid cell wall that surrounds it. Plants also have a rigid cell wall that surrounds their cell. So those are some of the differences that we see in, say, animal cells and plant cells, and then also in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Now, when we start looking at the organelles here, This is a eukaryotic cell here that has all of the internal organelles labeled in labeled in this diagram. So in this we see all the major organelles, kind of where they're found in the cell. So this kind of idealized model of a cell is good for us to kind of understand what's inside the cell. We'll come back to that in a second. And then the plant cell is very similar. We see a lot of the same organelles in plant cells, but they also have some other unique organelles like the cell wall I just mentioned, but also these chloroplasts, which are organelles where photosynthesis occurs. So plants have those as well. So in grouping these organelles, we can group these, and we do this in the outline, we can group these into categories about whether they specialize in manufacturing products or whether they are involved in metabolism and energy harvesting or energy production. So the first group of organelles that we're going to look at are those that are involved in manufacturing and making products. And the first one that we're going to look at is the nucleus. All right, so the nucleus is a large central organelle in the cell. And so it is a very important organelle in that it contains all the genetic information. So all of our genes are found in here, all of our DNA. We're going to get into that in a lot of detail in our next unit on genetics. So we'll learn quite a bit about it there. But here, this is introducing the organelle where all that stuff is found, and that is the nucleus. So the nucleus has its own membrane. So the cell has a membrane around it, and the nucleus has a membrane. It has a nuclear envelope that surrounds it. And so again, the nucleus is kind of considered the control center of the cell, and it has the genetic information in there. Okay, the next organelle we're going to look at is called the endoplasmic reticulum. The ER is what it's short for, the endoplasmic reticulum, ER. And that's in the blue here in the diagram. They've highlighted it blue. And there's two types of this endoplasmic reticulum. One is called smooth and one is called rough. All right, the smooth, and they're basically named based on whether they have ribosomes on their surface or not. So if they do not, they're considered smooth. If they do have ribosomes on their surface, they're considered rough. So you can just think about the surface of it for its name. Now, this is also a structure that is involved in producing and manufacturing products, and what it manufactures is not our genetic information, but it manufactures proteins, and it will carry proteins and other molecules from one part of the cell to another. And so what ends up happening is structures will come off of the ER and then move about in the cell to be distributed. So that is the ER. Another organelle that has a similar function is called the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi complex. And it has another very similar function of producing things that that separate from it and then travel about the cell. So it is involved in manufacturing products. Okay, the next group of organelles that we'll look at here are the organelles that function in metabolism and energy use. So these are more energy, have more of an energy function. And so the first one here is lysosomes. So let's see, lysosomes, here they are right down here. So they're small organelles little round organelle here, and their function is digestive in nature. So they help to break things down. So they will engulf waste products in the cell, help to break those down, and so that's its major function. Another is peroxisome, again, a very similar function of containing enzymes for breaking things down, and metabolic reactions will occur there. The next one we look at are vesicles and vacuoles. These are small structures here that separate from organelles and then move about within the cell. In the plant cell, let's skip over to that, there's one large central vacuole that it has. Animal cells have small vacuoles, but a plant cell has this very large central vacuole, and its major function is for storing water. Plants need to store a lot of water in their cells, and the central vacuole functions in that. But other than that, you can see that it has those same organelles that we just looked at in the animal cell. It has the nucleus, the ER, it has the Golgi apparatus. And the next one we look at in the outline is a very important organelle. It is the mitochondria. We'll talk about this organelle quite a bit when we get into some of our metabolic reactions in our let's see, next unit. Yeah, next unit. We'll be looking at some of that as well. And that most of that cellular respiration, which is part of our metabolic process, occurs here within this organelle. And so its major function is for transformation of energy from molecules we get in our diet to molecules that can be used in the cell. And so that's called a mitochondria. Now, plant cells have those as well. They carry out some cellular respiration as well. But they have another means of energy capturing. And that's what we look at next in the outline, and that is our plastids, which are only found in plant cells. The chloroplast here is a type of plastid, and it has chlorophyll in there that captures sunlight and is the site where photosynthesis occurs. So these are our major organelles that are involved in energy use. The next group of organelles we mentioned in the outline are the cytoskeletal elements. And that is, you see these fibrous structures that are in here. Within the cell, there is these fibers or structures that form a web or a net inside the cell. And this is where these organelles will hook to and move about. And these are called the cytoskeletal elements. There's some different types, and we list those out there in the outline. Microtubules, centrioles. Some of these form cilia and flagella. Like here's a flagella, is a long singular structure that comes off of a cell. And cilia are just smaller structures that come off of the cell. And so those are made up of these cytoskeletal elements. Let's see, here's a diagram here showing sperm cells are an example of a cell that has a flagella, long structure that comes off, and cilia are these smaller projections that come off of, like this cell right here has numerous cilia that are on it. Okay, the last thing we mentioned in our outline is these structures that hook cells together. There's three different types of ways that cells hook together: tight junction, desmosomes, and gap junctions. This shows a good example of tight junction, desmosomes that are like anchoring junction, and gap junctions that actually have a gap that allows space in between cells. And these are things that hold the cells together. Okay, so this concludes our podcast for this on the organelles of the cell. This also concludes the unit, our first unit.